1. A review of the fall of the Soviet Union. On the causes of betrayal and the tasks that the Communists have before them, one by Ludo Martens, April 2, 1992. Content 1. Towards Great World Upheavals. 2. Lenin, Stalin, and the Dictatorship of the Proletariat. 3. Khrushchev, the first break with the Socialist Revolution. 4. Brezhnev, degeneration accelerates. 5. Gorbachev, the restoration of capitalism. 6. The historical lessons to be learned from the Soviet Union and the countries from Eastern Europe. The leadership of the Communist Party is the decisive issue in the construction of socialism. Under socialism, the class struggle has to be continued to consolidate the dictatorship of the proletariat. Socialism is consolidated through the development of socialist democracy. The scientific and technological revolution is essential to demonstrate the superiority of socialism. The party has to maintain Marxism, Leninism and internationalism proletarian and adopt an independent position. 7. Towards Great World Upheavals. 1. Towards Great World Upheavals. In the Soviet Union, the world's first socialist state, the birthplace of Lenin and Stalin, where, after heroic efforts and immense sacrifices, the workers. 1. Original title, Balance of the Collapse of the Soviet Union. On the causes of a betrayal and the tasks ahead for communists. 2. Created a new society without exploiting classes. In this nation, very dear to the revolutionaries around the world, capitalism has finally been restored. It is the duty of all revolutionaries throughout the world to reflect on the causes of this tragedy, and make a careful analysis of the facts involved. Of course, the capitalists of the 5 continents have taken advantage of this unexpected event to proclaim the resounding message that socialism does not work and capitalism creates prosperity. And in every country, opportunists have defected to join the side of imperialist democracy, closing our eyes to the reality that capitalism that works so well in fact stands on millions of corpses, victims of the oppression and exploitation of the Third World. However, the clamor for the historic victory of capitalism had barely subsided. We had to conclude that the re-establishment of capitalism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union had aggravated all the fundamental contradictions of the world and that situations of great agitation and discomfort awaited us. Far from witnessing the end of the history, as an American government official once stated, or attending the end of the class struggle, we find ourselves at the beginning of a new phase of the global struggle of the oppressed against an imperialist world system, which has become incompatible with the very survival of hundreds of millions of human beings. In fact, the revolution socialism has become a simple matter of survival for the vast majority of the world population. The final betrayal of the revisionist movement could not have presented this case more clearly. However, if the oppressed part of humanity is to move towards its liberation, needs the help of combat organizations that have a clear perspective of the fundamental laws of the revolution. Communists around the world must make a reassessment of the course taken by the Soviet Union. They will have to clearly distinguish the revolution of the counter-revolution and the Marxism-Leninism of revisionism. The result of the opportunistic course taken by the Soviet Union allows us to propose some fundamental questions, which have been the subject of fierce discussion since 1956. Various positive, as well as negative, experiences demonstrate that adoption as a guide of a correct ideological line is decisive for the future of the Communist Party and the revolution. 3. 2. Lenin, Stalin, and the dictatorship of the proletariat. The first factories, the seeds of industrial European society, were built thanks to the genocide of the peoples of Black Africa and America. By carrying the civilization to the Inca and Aztec empires, European explorers caused approximately the death of 60 million indigenous inhabitants. You also have to take into account, of course, the enormous quantities of gold and silver extracted from the Americas through the use of slave labor. Since the beginning of the 16th century, European traders captured and sold as many as 100 into slavery. And 200 million Africans. Tens of millions of men and women lost their lives in Asia and Africa, while the colonial conquests of the last century led to the local societies into chaos, causing hunger, introducing diseases unknown, spreading the abuse of alcohol and opium. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution in Europe brought with it, among other acts of barbarism, the expulsion violence of millions of peasants from their lands and the forced labor of women and children up to 12 and 15 hours a day. In the First World War, the European bourgeois states they faced each other in a savage carnage, in order to divide the spoils of the colonies. 10 million workers paid with their lives for this colonial rivalry. In contrast to this reality, socialism could not develop or be maintained by other means than the organization of the dictatorship of the proletariat in order to unite all the popular classes against the bourgeoisie. This fundamental experience of Lenin and Stalin has acquired decisive importance in the recent political context of the peoples eager to free themselves from imperialist democracy. The defeat of the reformist option in Chile in 1973 and the elimination of Sandinista power in Nicaragua, after extensive concessions to the bourgeoisie, demonstrates the importance of the revolutionary principles defended by Lenin and Stalin. Russian workers and peasants had endured Tsarist oppression for hundreds of years, until they paid an excessively high price during the First World War, almost 3 million dead. From this unbearable suffering, the Bolsheviks drew the energy, courage, and determination necessary to organize the socialist revolution and break with the bourgeois dictatorship. The land and the means of production became the property of public property, the oppressive state machinery of the Tsarist regime was dismantled systematically and replaced by a state of workers and peasants. Supported by British, French, Czech, American, and other interventionist armies, foreign troops, reactionary classes and Tsarist forces launched the White Terror against socialism. Almost alone against the rest of the world, the Bolsheviks managed that the great masses of peasants stood on the side of the working class, and organized. 4. Mass terror against their enemies. In this baptism of fire, Bolshevism cast very firm roots among the peasant classes and among the poor. Without this firm terror socialism would not have triumphed in Russia, and the White Terror would have re-established the oppressive apparatus that had kept workers and people enslaved for centuries. Entire towns. This would have meant the rehabilitation of that strength of the reaction world known as Tsarism. It was Lenin who established the essential principles of socialist development under the dictatorship of the proletariat. When he died in 1924, however, this work had just finished begin. Between 1924 and 1953, the Bolshevik Party, under the leadership of Comrade Stalin, carried out the essential part of Lenin's projects. With unprecedented popular heroism, the Soviet Union built its socialist system and defended it against aggression from the fascism. In general, the Bolshevik Party and the Soviet people, under the leadership of Stalin, managed to complete the task started by Lenin. The Bolshevik Party managed to carry out socialist industrialization between 1921 and 1941, which allowed it to respond to the basic needs of workers and subsequently defeat the fascist armies. The collectivization of agriculture effectively blocked the spontaneous tendency to class differentiation in the countryside, especially the rise of a class of wealthy landowners known as kulaks, who would have been a mortal threat to the development of socialism in the Soviet Union. Thanks to collectivization, the system was capable of feeding a rapidly growing urban population. By organizing a cultural revolution, the Soviet Union managed to bring dozens of millions of illiterate peasants, who lived in medieval conditions, filled in the 20th century in a period of just 15 years. This effort produced an army of well-qualified and politically aware technicians and specialists who played a very important role in the anti-fascist war. From the 1920s to the 1950s, the Bolshevik Party contributed decisively to strengthening the international communist movement. The very existence of the Soviet Union made socialist revolutions possible in Eastern Europe and China. 5. Extraordinary victories that shocked the entire world. The successes of Reconstruction socialism within the Soviet Union, combined with a foreign policy that promoted independence and peace, gave a strong boost to the decolonization movement in Africa and in Asia. At this point, it is important to reflect for a moment on certain aspects of the struggle led by Stalin, which continue to provoke intense controversy. We talk about the collectivization and purges. In the Soviet Union of 1928, 7% of peasants were landless, 35% were poor peasants, 53% could be classified as poorly well-off, and 5% they were rich farmers, the so-called kulaks, who controlled 20% of all the grain they was sold. The natural course of events gave strength to this class of farmers rich, as they were able, by increasing control of the grain trade, of depriving cities of food and sabotaging socialist industrialization. The modernization of medieval agriculture, in which plows still predominated wood and horses, was absolutely necessary for industrialization to take place. Success. If the mechanization of the field had been carried out using the capital supplied by the rich kulak class, exploitation, misery, and hunger would have been an inevitable consequence for the majority of farmers. Furthermore, undoubtedly, a rural bourgeois class would have attacked socialism as soon as it had the opportunity. To defend the power of the workers, there was no other possible path than collectivization. During this process, the hatred accumulated for years by the peasants poor against the rich class of the kulaks exploded. This class struggle organized by the poor and middle peasants proved to be the decisive factor in collectivization. Like him, Bolshevik Party did not have more than 200,000 members in the countryside. The impact of the party was limited in those early years. The collectivization process continued ahead as civil war broke out again in the countryside. The rich landowners and the reactionaries murdered a large number of peasant cadres and leaders, and they sacrificed part of the livestock to sabotage the collective economy. The repression that poor peasants carried out against the kulaks was largely a reaction uncontrolled against centuries of oppression and humiliation. The purges that the Bolshevik Party organized during the years 1937 to 1938 resulted necessary in view of the proximity of war. However, these purges were not free of serious errors, most of which are inevitable due to the complexity of the struggle. Stalin knew very well that the ominous international situation and the possibility growing war of aggression against the Soviet Union cast a bright light particular about the political struggle within the party. He correctly suspected that, in view of the approaching world conflict, Nazi Germany and other imperialist powers they had sent spies, saboteurs and other agents into the country. Between classes. 6. Defeated bourgeoisie of the Soviet Union, there were quite a few candidates willing to take his revenge by helping the imperialist cause. The opportunists and defeatists within of the party, impressed by the superiority of the imperialist system, could try establish contact with the enemy. Stalin organized a huge popular mobilization to support the purge. The purifying movement was directed against two types of adversaries of the socialism. The first were the elements of the old oppressor classes who wanted to take revenge for their defeat, the capitulationists, and the pro-German elements who they expected a Nazi attack that would bring them liberation. The second type of enemies fought by popular power were bureaucrats and technocrats who had distanced themselves from the masses and were rapidly transforming into a new bourgeoisie, ready to succumb to the most powerful, p.e.g. before Hitler's Germany, in order to defend their personal interests. Thus, a purge of the socialist movement was absolutely necessary. Under the conditions of that time, this also meant that it was inevitable to make many mistakes. Sometimes bureaucrats, in order to preserve their positions, they managed to divert surveillance towards innocent people. The opportunists, to promote their careers within the party, they falsely accused party cadres. Agents' enemies infiltrated into the party fabricated evidence to incriminate loyal communists, and honest communists committed leftist excesses. In general, however, the purges achieved their objective. This was demonstrated during the anti-fascist war, when, contrary to the situation in other countries, there were very few collaborators in the Soviet Union to support the Nazis. In Western Europe, as Stalin had predicted, many opportunists joined the Nazi occupation forces. The leaders' Belgian Social Democrats publicly hailed Adolf Hitler as a liberator. In France, a majority of Social Democrats voted in favor of granting full powers to the Pétain's collaborationist regime. Taking these facts into account, there is nothing surprising that all bourgeois factions unanimously denounced the purges criminals organized by the Bolshevik Party. The established power, most of the barons of industry, the bankers, the cadres of the nationalist parties, the Christian Democratic, Liberal, and Social Democratic parties collaborated with the Nazis while their victory seemed certain to them. In view of the recent complete restoration of capitalism in the USSR under Gorbachev, we can better understand some aspects of the purges of 1937 to 38. Stalin stated that Trotskyists, Bukharin partisans, and bourgeois nationalists advocated a bourgeois politics, and that in fact defended the interests of the defeated oppressor classes. With their counter-revolutionary actions, they helped these classes and other movements anti-socialists to regroup their forces. Stalin maintained that his victory would mean full restoration of capitalism. Khrushchev said that this analysis was erroneous and that it led to arbitrary actions. The nationalist theses and ideas of Trotsky and Bukharin began to reappear in the politics of the CPSU. Finally, Gorbachev rehabilitated the Trotskyists, the Bukharinists and bourgeois nationalists as good people and victims of Stalinism. 2 years later, the total restoration of capitalism was a fact. The history has shown that Stalin's point of view on this question was completely correct. 7. 3. Khrushchev, the first break with the socialist revolution. Let us now recall the 4 essential theses presented by Khrushchev 30 years ago. Which will allow us to better understand recent events in the USSR. First thesis, in the Soviet Union power no longer belongs to the working class. The state of the working class has been replaced by the state of all the people, a state for all social classes. After ensuring the total and definitive victory of socialism and the movement towards the final achievement of communism, the dictatorship of the proletariat has fulfilled its objective, the state has been transformed into a state of the entire people. This idea led to the abandonment of the fight against bourgeois and reactionary tendencies influenced by the imperialism. Likewise, it greatly reassured a bureaucracy that was seeking distance yourself from workers. In a state for all the people, this bureaucracy could settle comfortably, acquire privileges and obtain personal benefits at the expense of their political and economic positions. After all, there could no longer be contradictions of class between them and the mass of workers, as was said then. Second thesis, Khrushchev announced in 1962 that the Soviet Union would achieve communism in 1980, and which at that point would have surpassed the United States. It won't take us overtake the United States economically for a long time. In the competition peacefully with the United States, the Soviet Union will achieve a historic victory of universal importance. Do we have everything necessary to create the material and technical base that allow us to achieve communism in 2 decades? Yes, friends, we have everything you need. So today the Soviet Union should enjoy eternal bliss of fully developed communism, abundance for all, and all this since 1980. In reality, these promises of an ideal future calmed the masses, among whom the ideas of revolution, socialism, and communism were very popular, and they consolidated the positions of bureaucrats and technocrats in power. Khrushchev's third thesis, he declared that capitalism would collapse throughout the world as socialism moved irresistibly towards final victory. The quick path of progress of the Soviet Union would attract the sympathy of workers around the world, while capitalism, seriously weakened, would not be able to oppose it. This explained why it was possible to assume power in Europe and the rest of the world so peaceful and parliamentary. More favorable conditions have developed in other countries for the victory of socialism, due to the socialist triumph in the Soviet Union. The huge field of the socialist countries, where the population already includes more than 900 million inhabitants, continues to grow and become stronger. The ideas of socialism have firmly rooted in the spirit of the entire working class. Capitalism has become much weaker. The right-wing bourgeois parties and their governments fail disastrously. Increasingly resounding. This opened the possibility of conquering a solid majority in the parliament and transform this parliament into an instrument of true popular power. These positions, which embellished imperialist society and the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, they constituted a radical change in policy. 8. Khrushchev's fourth point concerned the attitude toward the United States. The imperialist superpower had until then been considered the number one policeman of the world, which intervened and aggressively pursued its interests in the 5 continents. But then Khrushchev declared, "We want to be friends of the United States. United and cooperate with them in the fight for peace and security for the people. Us we commit to achieving this goal, with good intentions and without any hidden objective." This came at a time when numerous third world nations in Asia, Africa, or South America were involved in a terrible struggle against imperialism. American, who wanted to subject them to neocolonial rule. For Brezhnev, degeneration accelerates. Then Brezhnev arrived. Some communists thought he had distanced himself from the Khrushchev's most flagrant mistakes. The analysis of the 4-party congresses that chaired does not confirm this opinion at all. Nikita Khrushchev had proclaimed 3 key issues: the end of the class struggle, a state for the entire people, and the defense of the interests of the privileged bureaucracy. Brezhnev continued down that path. He presented the public with brilliant images of a society without classes, which hid a growing differentiation of classes and social strata. He applauded the closing of the gap between classes and social groups. Our intellectuality considers it their duty to devote all their creative energy to the construction of communist society. However, while he was saying this, an important part of this intellectuality was completely depoliticized and fascinated by the West. In the Brezhnev's dreams not only class differences disappeared, but also the distinctions between nationalities. Brezhnev invented the notion of the Soviet people, in which classes and nationalities had disappeared without a trace. In our country, we have witnessed the formation of a new historical community, the Pueblo Soviet. New harmonious relationships between classes and social groups and between nations and nationalities have emerged from common work. With Brezhnev, Marxism-Leninism went from being the science of class struggle to becoming an ideology. By ideology we mean the false knowledge that represents the interests of a privileged group that separates itself from the workers. Never, during those 4-party congresses, Brezhnev managed to understand the living reality of the different classes, social strata and political forces in order to lead to struggle or mobilization. 9. Under the Brezhnev regime, the bureaucratic elite took root firmly and almost definitive. Brezhnevism ensured comfort for a new bourgeois class. A Khrushchev follower George Medvedev wrote, "In Stalin's time, officials of the party felt the potential threat of the security apparatus, even more intensity than ordinary citizens." Medvedev went on to say, Brezhnev was not a true leader in 1964. Rather he represented the bureaucracy that sought an easy life, with assured and increasing privileges. His electorate was the bureaucratic elite. In this regard, Brezhnev also transformed the system because he, more than anyone else, created the appropriate conditions for the extension of a truly privileged elite, a true nomenclature. With a comfortable and secure life, the members of the elite were not satisfied with their legal income. The stability of the elite had another negative effect. Official corruption it developed rapidly at all levels. Party discipline decreased, nepotism became a regular practice, and ideological and administrative prestige of the party was tarnished. The great corruption of high Soviet officials became a kind of occupational disease. The distinction between property public and private property was no longer respected. Far from denouncing Khrushchev's mistakes, Brezhnev continued down the same path. Disastrous path, being responsible for a revisionist deviation even worse than that of Khrushchev. Furthermore, Brezhnev gave a militaristic orientation to all Soviet policy. I counted almost exclusively with the extension of Soviet military power to defend and expand the position of the Soviet Union. The strengthening of the Soviet state represents the maximum extension of the defense capacity of our homeland. He welcomed the balance sustained military and strategic between the USSR and the United States. The path to military and nuclear parity with the Western military-industrial complex is not practical, and it is destructive for a socialist country. With mass mobilization, the continuation of class struggle and revolutionary education abandoned in the Museum of History, Brezhnev opted for a military conception worthy of his adversaries. Everything that constituted the force of a socialist defense in Stalin's time disappeared. A military effort disproportionately completely undermined the civilian economy of the Soviet Union. In reality, through the combined effects of revisionism and hegemonism, Brezhnev ruined the international communist movement. In 1966 he excommunicated China and Albania, accusing these countries of Stalinism and leftist deviations because they had expressed their disapproval of Khrushchev's revisionism. 3 more years Brezhnev later transformed the political confrontation with China into an armed conflict. 10. Intoxicated by Khrushchev's new ideas, a large number of communist parties tended towards a reconciliation with the bourgeoisie of their own countries, causing the subsequent breakup of the international communist movement. In the socialist countries of Eastern Europe, Dubček and others in the same vein proposed the liquidation of the last vestiges of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the introduction of a bourgeois social democratic system. The parties that refused to accept the model Soviet as the only reference, and who opposed the dictates and intervention Soviet influence in the affairs of other countries, were disavowed by Brezhnev for their nationalism and its anti-Sovietism. Finally, only those who showed an unconditional loyalty to the USSR. Brezhnev called them authentic Marxist-Leninists. While revisionism undermined the foundations of socialism in Eastern Europe, Brezhnev had to rely on military control to continue maintaining the appearance of unity in the socialist camp. He went so far as to proclaim, "The borders of the socialist community are inviolable and unassailable. The brotherhood of the United Socialist countries is the best defense against the forces that try to attack and weaken the socialist camp." From whatever point of view, the Soviet Union expresses its loyalty to internationalism proletarian. But his interference and growing fondness for direct control eroded this sick socialism. The theory of defense of the Soviet Union as the best protection for socialism was unviable. The best defense of socialism will always be mobilization of workers, the development of their class consciousness, and their effort independent to defend proletarian power. On these bases a socialist country can ask another friendly nation for help, but only in exceptional circumstances and for a period of time. Limited period of time. This is what the Democratic Republic of Korea did, for example, when it was attacked by the American Army in 1950. The World Revolution, as Brezhnev saw it, consisted essentially of the extension of Soviet influence throughout the world, following the model of Europe Eastern. Brezhnev denied that world socialism was born from the mixture of different national revolutionary experiences. He did not recognize the fact that the party's revolutionaries must be anchored in the specific reality of their country, they must mobilize broad masses for the revolutionary struggle, and that they have to crush the imperialism and local reaction. Brezhnev rejected the idea that only the popular masses' armed forces can form an effective bulwark against imperialism and reaction. Continuous deceiving the people of the Third World, by presenting the Soviet army as the best guarantee of their freedoms. Brezhnev, socialism is the best defense for people who fight for its freedom and independence. Under the leadership of Brezhnev, the Soviet Union supported reformists, coup plotters, and adventurers as well as militarists, whom he invariably presented as architects of the socialist revolution. Since the Soviet Union was on their side and their army constituted 11. The best defense for their freedoms, Brezhnev intervened in several countries to maintain power to pro-Soviet reformist forces. This adventurist policy reached its peak with the invasions of Kampuchea and Afghanistan. 5. Gorbachev, the restoration of capitalism. The best analysis of the existing reality in the socialist countries during the period 1956-1990 is still what Comrade Mao Zedong made in the 60s. Today this analysis can be refined more precisely and corrected in light of recent events that have occurred in Eastern Europe, the USSR, and China. Mao Zedong wrote, Socialist society covers an extremely long historical period. The struggle of classes between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat will continue until the end of this period. The question about which system will be victorious, capitalism or the socialist path, always will remain open during said period. This means that the danger of restoration capitalist is still present. The socialist revolution carried out exclusively in the economic field is not sufficient and does not guarantee stability. There must be a complete socialist revolution in the fields of politics and ideology. In the domain of politics and ideology, the struggle to decide the question of capitalism versus socialism will last a long time. Decades will surely not be enough, 100, maybe even hundreds of years will be necessary for final victory. During this historical period of socialism we have to maintain the dictatorship of the proletariat and bring the socialist revolution to its culmination if we want to prevent a capitalist restoration. We have to start rebuilding socialist movement to create the necessary conditions for the transition to communism. After Khrushchev came to power, the activities of the new bourgeois elements were limited and above all repressed. But since Khrushchev came to power and gradually assumed the leadership of the party and the state, the new bourgeois elements began to appear in dominant positions at the heart of the party and the government, in the field of economics as well as in the cultural sector and others. Those elements bourgeois have become a privileged class in Soviet society. Even under the rule of Khrushchev and his faction, the mass of the members of the CPSU and the people follow the glorious revolutionary traditions cultivated by Lenin and Stalin, adhering to socialism and aspiring to progress towards communism. A large number of Soviet cadres continue to support the revolutionary position of the proletariat and the path towards socialism. They are totally against Khrushchev's revisionism. The class struggle, the struggle for production and for scientific experimentation are the three main revolutionary movements in the construction of a socialist nation. 12. Powerful. These movements represent a sure guarantee that allows the communists abolish bureaucracy, arm yourself against revisionism and dogmatism and remain undefeated. They constitute the further guarantee that will allow the proletariat to unite with the great masses workers and practice a democratic dictatorship. We must assume that, in the absence of those movements, the landowners, the rich farmers, the counter-revolutionaries, the confusionist elements and other creatures of different kinds will be left to their free will. Furthermore, suppose that our cadres closed their eyes and did not make any distinction between the enemy and us in any case, but that they collaborate with the enemy and let them corrupt and demoralize. If our paintings were captured by the faction enemy in this way, or if the enemy managed to infiltrate our ranks, and if many of our workers, peasants, and intellectuals will be defenseless against the brutal tactics of the enemy, if these assumptions came true, then a short time would pass, perhaps a few years or a decade, before a counter-revolutionary restoration would inevitably occur on a national scale. In this case, not long before the party Marxist-Leninist Party became a revisionist or fascist party, all of China would change color. In Lenin's country, Khrushchev assumed power in 1956, after 3 years of skillful maneuvers and complex preparations. After taking power, he had to consolidate it within of the party by eliminating most of the political bureau during the fight against the anti-Molotov-Malenkov-Kaganovich party faction. With political and ideological attacks against the essential principles of socialist construction, Khrushchev continued to modify the fundamental orientation of the CPSU. The above should have been an excuse to allow cadres of bureaucrats and opportunists acquired privileges and became a distinctive social class. Even after Khrushchev's elimination, certain cadres' principles attempted to return to Marxist-Leninist principles. The socialist base of the society was not yet destroyed and millions of communists persevered in their work revolutionary. During the Brezhnev period, however, the leading class accumulated even more privileges and enriched himself through various illegal means. But anyway, they had to vegetate like parasites on an economic and political basis that was not his. True communists could still defend many of the company's acquisitions. Working class socialist laws, favorable measures for workers and Marxist-Leninist ideology continued to exert great influence in all parts of the society. The ruling class reduced Marxism to a series of ready-made formulas and imported all kinds of ideological theories from the West. While socialist thought was mutilated, a series of outdated bourgeois ideologies gained new impetus. In a growing number of sectors, the new bourgeois elements transformed the media of production and state property in its private property. They enabled the extension of the informal sector and made deals with the new capitalists whose emergence they had favored. By the end of the Brezhnev era, a new capitalist class had consolidated and he defended his own interests, opposed to those of the workers. This new class, now fully developed, it tried with increasing force to install its own dictatorship open. To do this he had to free the country from the latest influences and appearances of 13. Marxism-Leninism. In Gorbachev he found a banner, in glasnost a means of expression and in perestroika a legitimation of their restorative projects. Behind him period of paralysis, conformism and militarism under the leadership of Brezhnev, really we had the feeling that things were moving in the USSR, and that some of the errors most serious events of the Brezhnev era were coming to light. But it soon became clear that Gorbachev criticized Brezhnev from the point of view of liberals and pro-Western. Gorbachev it simply deepened the revisionism of Khrushchev and Brezhnev, which led to the rejection open and complete of Marxist-Leninist principles. The Soviet Union has witnessed two major breaking points with socialism: Khrushchev's report in 1956, which contains the rejection of some Leninist principles essentials, and Gorbachev's perestroika, which prepared the ground, in 1990, for the re-establishment of the market economy. Khrushchev's revisionism opened a period of transition from socialism to capitalism. It took 30 years for the old and new bourgeois elements to acquire the strength enough to allow them to occupy and consolidate their positions in politics, in the field ideologically and economically. The degeneration process, which began in 1956, required 3 decades to end socialism. Attacks on Stalin's legacy have played an important role throughout this whole process of degeneration. In the Soviet Union, the revisionists have worked 35 years to overthrow Stalin. Once Stalin was overthrown, Lenin continued almost immediate. Khrushchev incited everyone against Stalin, and Gorbachev, during the 5 years of his glasnost, the crusade against Stalinism continued. Has the reader noticed that the demolition of Lenin's statues was not preceded by a political campaign against his work? The campaign against Stalin was enough. Once all of Stalin's political ideas were attacked, denigrated, and rejected, it was simply concluded that, equally in this way, all of Lenin's ideas were finished. Khrushchev began his destructive mission underlining the fact that he criticized Stalin's cult of personality in order to re-establish Leninism in its pure form and improve the communist system. Gorbachev he made the same deceptive promises to disorient the forces of the left. Today in day we can see the obvious results. Under the pretext of return to Lenin he invited the Tsar, and under the pretext of improving socialism, it has established savage capitalism. 14. 6. The historical lessons to be learned from the Soviet Union and the countries from Eastern Europe. The leadership of the Communist Party is the decisive issue in the construction of socialism. In the course of the development of the class struggle in many countries we have seen that all bourgeois and petty bourgeois parties have tried to crush the forces revolutionary. In countries as different as Russia, China, Cuba, or the Republic German Democratic Revolution, the revolution finally triumphed under the leadership of the Party Communist, the only party with revolutionary content. A correct address politics by the Communist Party, creatively applying the principles of scientific socialism in accordance with the reality of the corresponding country, is necessary to the victory of the revolution and the construction of socialism. Get out of the Communist Party, there can be no future for socialism. For the bourgeoisie living under socialism, the key question is this: how to expand the democracy. For the bourgeoisie it is very important to create a legal space for their old people. Parties, crushed during the revolution. For the proletariat and the workers, key question is this: How to ensure that the Communist Party maintains its revolutionary spirit, its socialist line and its relations with the masses? If the party makes too many serious mistakes, the revolution will be defeated and the construction of the socialism will find itself in a crisis that can be fatal. Revisionism in the Communist Party represents the influence and pressure of the bourgeoisie and imperialism. If the cadres act in a bureaucratic manner, they lose the contact with the masses, seek benefits and privileges and act as technocrats without a revolutionary consciousness, succumbing to corruption. Then, inevitably, an opportunistic tendency develops within the party, which leads to a return to the old order based on class society and the exploitation of man by man. Under socialism, the class struggle has to be continued to consolidate the dictatorship of the proletariat. Workers must be prepared ideologically and practically to fight against the anti-socialist forces, developed by class enemies and encouraged by intervention and subversion organized by imperialism. 15. As long as the above continues to exist, imperialism will never stop preparing its reappearance in socialist countries. It will focus its efforts on invading the ideological field and political in the first place, supporting sinister forces hostile to the Communist Party, demanding freedom for the bourgeois press, encouraging workers' unions to act separately from the Communist Party, and creating legal and political parties illegals hostile to the Communists. The fight for the elimination of the internal and external bases for a capitalist restoration it is a struggle of several generations. During a long historical period, the dictatorship of the working masses has to be defended against the old and the new exploiters. If the dictatorship of the working masses relaxes, the bourgeoisie re-emerges again and the battle for the restoration of his own dictatorship. In the Soviet Union we have witnessed this, even 70 years after its defeat, the supporters of Tsarism, the feudalists, the bourgeois and the kulaks have managed to maintain and subsequently expand its ideological and political influence over a sector of the masses. With the development of productive forces and the increase in production in general, it is possible that a socialist country will be forced to accept, over a period of time significantly, the existence of a sector of small capitalists and private entrepreneurs and even foreign capitalist investment. It will also be necessary to accept various forms of commercial, financial, and scientific relations with the imperialist world. All these factors make it absolutely necessary to reinforce ideological work and maintenance of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Under socialism, the party has to use Marxist science to analyze in a way materialist the social differentiations that develop in society. In the Soviet Union, the revisionists maintained that the exploiting classes no longer existed and that the workers, peasants, and intellectuals had the same interest in defending socialism. By promoting this view, they destroyed class surveillance and allowed the development of bureaucracy, opportunism, and technocracy in the ranks of cadres and intellectuals. In this way, a new exploiting class emerged in the heart of the socialist society. The Communist Party is the essential instrument for the correct use of the dictatorship of the proletariat. If the party is filled with opportunist tendencies, the heart of socialism will be infected. The party must continue organizing the political struggle, educating and mobilizing workers to consolidate the power of the proletariat. The Army. 16. Socialist and popular militia must be ready to respond to possible actions of hostile forces and aggression by imperialist forces in general. Socialism is consolidated through the development of socialist democracy. If the Communist Party acts in an authentically revolutionary way, while the struggle of classes is correctly maintained against the enemies of socialism, democracy socialist will have ample space to develop. How socialist democracy develops depends, of course, on the situation of the national and international class struggle. The Communist Party must strive to continually perfect and expand socialist democracy. One of the fundamental aspects of this democracy is the possibility that the masses have workers to observe and judge the actions and postures of the members and cadres of the party and officials of the socialist state. To develop this democracy, the socialist government has to ensure education, high-quality general scientific and political education for all its citizens. The Communist Party must create the conditions for active participation of the workers, their representatives, and their mass organizations in local affairs and in the regional and national government. The law must establish the rights and obligations of citizens within the framework of socialist society. The scientific and technological revolution is essential to demonstrate the superiority of socialism. The development of science and technology is very important in the global fight between socialism and capitalism. In these fields, imperialism, relying on 5 centuries of looting carried out throughout the world, still has great advantages. Socialism, it can never be developed without acquiring the most advanced scientific knowledge. Under the direction of a socialist ideology, a cultural revolution must be strongly encouraged, scientific and technological. A socialist country has to strive to assimilate the scientific and technological discoveries and management techniques developed in the 17. capitalist world. However, it must always be recognized that all these discoveries have been carried out in the context of a bourgeois social structure based on exploitation of the workers. Often, by belonging to this bourgeoisie and living in conditions privileged, most of the scientists, engineers, and managers of the capitalist world, they maintain a bourgeois and even reactionary vision of the world. This ideology is reflected even in the conception and use of some of his scientific discoveries. The assimilation of science and technology from the capitalist world must be carried out under the leadership of the party and from a socialist point of view. Marxist-Leninist education and the political struggle against bourgeois influences must accompany this process of assimilation. This is an important aspect of the class struggle under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Certainly, the experience of the Soviet Union demonstrates the counter-revolutionary role that numerous scientists and other intellectuals have played, highly esteemed, committed to the bourgeois conception of the world. The party has to maintain Marxism-Leninism and proletarian internationalism and take an independent position. 2 aspects of a contradiction are involved here, in which we must distinguish clearly the relationships as well as the oppositions. Above all, the Marxist-Leninist path and the constant practice of proletarian internationalism. The working class is the internationalist class par excellence. His position in all exploiting societies is fundamentally the same, and the law's basic principles that can be deduced from the revolutionary struggle are, in broad terms, common to all countries. With the benefit of hindsight, we can clearly see that certain opportunists rejected these basic positions, unfairly invoking the principle of a stance independent. In 1948, Tito claimed the right to follow a specific Yugoslav path towards socialism. With this pretext, he in fact defended a policy of reconciliation of classes and opposition to the dictatorship of the proletariat. The recent catastrophe in Yugoslavia, devastated by national and fascist civil wars, is the ultimate consequence of the THIRD revisionism. During the 1970s and 1980s, the Italian Communist Party also made loud proclamations about their independence, praising the advantages of the Italian way to the socialism. Under this banner they got rid of the last Marxist-Leninist principles. 18. They cut all ties with the Soviet Union and finally fell into positions fully social democrats. If a communist party makes a turn in an opportunistic direction, the intervention of other communist parties in the internal affairs of that party cannot solve the problem, but on the contrary. However, proletarian internationalism means that others parties, during their discussions with the affected party, may carry out a struggle of principles against opportunism and revisionism. The criticized party can, in a way totally independent, accept or reject these analyses and observations. Will continue to be the one exclusively responsible for his political line before the working class and the people. A problem of a completely different nature arose in the country's Eastern European socialists. The communist parties of these countries were very weak in 1945, but, with the help of the Bolshevik Party, they undertook the class struggle, they established the dictatorship of the proletariat and established the foundations for an independent socialist economy. After Stalin's death, Khrushchev intervened in his internal affairs to eliminate the revolutionary cadres who were identified as Stalinists. The opportunists who later came to power accepted all the Khrushchev's anti-Marxist theses. Most of them not only liquidated Marxism-Leninism, but also sold its independence very cheaply, after all the twists and turns of Soviet politics. The Romanian Communist Party also followed the opportunist positions defended by Khrushchev, although he maintained a certain independence. The rejection of both Marxism-Leninism and the principle of independence was the cause of the failure of socialism in the countries of Eastern Europe. At that time, however, another small socialist country showed an alternative path. The Korean Labour Party always maintained contact with the parties of Europe Eastern, which could have benefited from the Korean experience. In fact, even before the revisionist Khrushchev took office, Kim Il-sung said the following: "What are we doing? We are not making revolution in a foreign country, but we make the revolution in Korea. All ideological work must be subordinated to the interests of the Korean Revolution. If we study the history of the CPSU or that of the Revolution China, or if we study the universal principles of Marxism-Leninism, we only do so to correctly carry out our revolution. We must carefully study our own reality and learn to know it very well. Otherwise we will not be capable of solving the new problems we face in a way creative, which is also adapted to our own reality." Several colleagues they gulped down Marxism-Leninism instead of digesting it and learning to use it. So it is absolutely logical that they cannot undertake revolutionary initiatives. We must be irrevocably governed by Marxist-Leninist principles and apply them consistently. Creative way, according to the specific conditions of our country and our nation. He. 19. Marxism-Leninism is not a dogma, it is a guide for action and a doctrine creative. Marxism-Leninism can only prove its invincible power if it is applied in a creative way and depending on the specific situation of each country. In 1970, when Brezhnev was practicing his limited sovereignty policy, Kim Il-sung expounded the fundamental concept of independence even more clearly. The establishment of the JIT idea means the adoption of an excellent attitude towards revolution and the reconstruction of the country itself. It means maintaining a position independent, rejecting the spirit of dependence on others, means to have confidence in our own leaders and in our own strength and in maintaining of a revolutionary spirit, always solving problems under our own responsibility. It also means adherence to a creative position, as opposed to the dogmatism. The universal principles of Marxism-Leninism and the experiences of others' countries must be applied in accordance with historical conditions and the characteristics nationals of their own country. Historical experience shows that if a party surrenders to the great powers, this leads to the failure of the revolution and progress. It is important to emphasize that the concept of independence, as it has been developed by Kim Il-sung, is based on loyalty to revolutionary principles. Maintain a position independently implies, above all, trusting in one's own forces to make the revolution and to build socialism, thus making an important contribution to the fight for liberation of the world proletariat. However, a party cannot defeat an enemy. Powerful, carry out social experiments and oppose pressure, sabotage and imperialist intervention, if it does not educate people in an authentic Marxist-Leninist spirit. Without this spirit, a party will not be able to stand on its own feet and consequently will not be able to maintain its system socialist and its independence from the interference and aggression of the imperialist world. We can also point out that during the great debate within the communist movement internationally, the Korean Labour Party clearly saw the danger of revisionism, adopted an independent position and made an effort to maintain the unity in the international communist movement. At this very moment, when we see that the former socialist countries are restoring the private company and promoting the invasion of multinationals, it is interesting to remember Kim Il-sung's analysis of revisionism in 1970. Revisionism is an opportunist ideological current that tends to deprive Marxism-Leninism of its spirit revolutionary. Revisionism is harmful because it denies the Marxist-Leninist line of the party and the dictatorship of the proletariat. It opposes class struggle, makes borders between us and our enemy seem nebulous and uncertain, and capitulate to the 20. American imperialism, scared by nuclear blackmail. It is the most dangerous movement due to his flirtation with imperialism, while pretending to defend a position anti-imperialist, abandons the fight against imperialism and tries to get closer to its postures. Revisionism implies spreading the fear of war, pacifist ideas, bourgeoisie, and the illusions about imperialism and the reaction in general to disarm ideologically to the people. He hates oppressed people and does everything he can to prevent them. His revolution. Finally, we must emphasize that revisionism is also dangerous because it opposes revolutionary organizational discipline, promotes liberalism bourgeois, encourages individualistic selfishness, and leads people to indifference, decadence, and idleness. In short, revisionism is a dangerous ideology, which undermines socialism and leads to the restoration of capitalism. This analysis, these predictions, have turned out to be accurate. And today we must realize that the opportunists did not heed these warnings in the name of the fight against dogmatism and Stalinism, to withdraw, step by step, to the side of imperialism, war, and terror against the people. 7. Towards great world upheavals. The new bourgeoisie of the Soviet Union openly proclaimed its political dictatorship on society during the 28th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, in July 1990. From that moment on, political intervention and financial control and economy of the United States and Germany grew systematically, leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the creation of independent republics promoted by world imperialism. The accelerated counter-revolutionary process was hailed by the Western bourgeoisie as an authentic revolution, which would ensure peace, freedom, and democracy for all eternity. In Belgium, all bourgeois formations and petty bourgeois without exception, from fascists to social democrats, environmentalists, and the remnants of the dying Communist Party, welcomed this revolution of peace, freedom, and democracy. Barely 2 years have passed, however, and easily we can see that the counter-revolution in the East and in the Soviet Union has not led to peace, freedom, and democracy, but to war, oppression, exploitation, and fascism. Sometime after the Soviet Union defected to the Western side, the imperialism launched an aggressive war against the Iraqis that caused between 150,000 and 250,000 deaths of Iraqi citizens, military, and civilians alike. The economic boycott maintained since the war has caused the death of more than 170,000 children to date. Today, this criminal war has openly revealed a number of new features in the methods used by imperialism to dominate the Third World. The big ones. 21. Imperialist powers are willing to use the most sophisticated war technology, as they did in Iraq, against any Third World country that dares to defend its independence and sovereignty. We are witnesses of the development of state terrorism, barbaric and inhuman. The Gulf War was never intended to restore Kuwait's independence, but rather, ensure its separation from the Arab world, its annexation as a kind of State 53 of the USA, and the seizure by the West of the oil resources of the Middle East. The duty to intervene is the new motto with which imperialism rejects sovereignty of the Third World countries and dismantles international legality to replace it with its own colonial-type rule, creating enclaves, slowly strangling countries through economic boycott, and openly supporting pro-imperialist forces. The conditions of surrender imposed on Iraq demonstrate that the new colonization economic development, largely carried out during the 1980s, has now been completed with the new political and military colonization. We are in fact returning to colonial slavery. The Democratic and Republican parties of the United States, the Democratic parties Christians, liberals, nationalists, conservatives, and socialists of Europe, all of them participated in the attack. Western democracy demonstrates once again that its pluralism works mainly in favor of the forces that support barbarism imperialist. The West is ready to mobilize all its capital and all its technology in order to expand its empire of exploitation and terror. Imperialism has become a diabolical system whose existence is incompatible with the simple survival of several billions of people in the Third World. To crush a small Third World country with 18 million inhabitants, the United States had to mobilize a considerable amount of money and forces armed. The great destructive force concentrated in a small point on the globe reveals a weakness at a strategic level. At this moment, when oppression and misery become increasingly intolerable, the objective conditions for revolutionary movements to large scale develop favorably. Ruined and groaning under the pressure of a crisis after another, third world countries offer few opportunities for investment. Profitable therefore, to preserve their unjust system, they force the powers imperialists to increasingly employ military-type solutions to maintain order. Imperialism has nothing to offer the masses of the Third World, and is the subject of a growing hatred on their part. 22. After the collapse of socialism in the East, a series of ideologues announced that, from now on, only capitalism would write history. But capitalism appears in the form of three great powers that observe each other with concern and suspicion, ready to take out your weapons. The world market, which is now expanding very slowly, has become too small to satisfy the desires of the three insatiable gangsters, the United States, Japan, and Germany. Each one keeps his portion with the help of investments colossal, ever increasing the tendency towards a lower rate of benefits. Its modern facilities produce enormous quantities of products in series that are only digested with difficulty by markets that are barely expanding. Each new day contemplates the emergence of commercial conflicts between the three great powers in the fields of automobile production, the development of aerial technology and space, communications, chemicals, etc. The imperialist world is heading slowly towards major economic and financial crises. If the structures of socialism in Eastern Europe collapsed at the right time, it takes time to tear down a wall. The fragile structure of global capitalism can collapse as quickly as that of his opponent. Under the tension of the three powers confronted with each other, the future of the capitalist world appears bleak. It has been said that the collapse of socialism was proof of the good health of the capitalist system and that offered new possibilities for capitalism for its expansion. It is true that the conquest of the East can add another 5% to the growth rate of the German economy in the years to come. But it will be at the cost of the collapse of the structures economies of the East and the former Soviet Union. A 20% decline in GNP has took place in just 2 years. Thanks to free enterprise, some 10 million workers, 2.2 million in Poland alone, have already lost their jobs. The unemployed, who no longer benefit from social security, and the elderly pensioners find themselves mired in a quagmire of misery. Suicide figures increase, as does the crime rate. An unscrupulous, illegal, and savage capitalism is developing in the eastern countries. Those who promised socialism with a face human have brought the most inhuman capitalism. In 1989, the West caused the exodus of East Germans to destabilize the economic and political order of the GDR. Those who they crossed the border and were hailed as heroes of freedom by the bourgeois press. Today there are millions of such potential heroes of freedom, millions of Poles, Hungarians, Romanians, etc., trying to escape poverty and find a job in the West. The same bourgeois press is now worried about the danger of an invasion of this and demands the closure of the borders. The freedom revolutions were widely acclaimed. Surely freedom people's main goal is freedom from all foreign domination. In a few years, the former socialist countries have fallen into a state of absolute economic dependence and financial. Imperialism dictates its laws just as it would in any neocolonial country. From the Third World. The Soviet Union had a national deficit of $30 billion. $23 in 1985. Today it has grown to $80 billion and continues to increase. The new bourgeoisie made people believe that Western capital was going to invest money in their welfare. However, big capital did not accept any type of risk and they limited their investments to the acquisition of part of the best companies at affordable prices. Tiny in this way, the national wealth of the former socialist countries was sold. The country that has undoubtedly made the most profits from this sale is Germany, which it also benefits from relations between the GDR and other former socialist countries. Germany is by far the largest creditor, and the most active buyer of large quantities of companies at ridiculous prices. Today it is the most commercial partner important. In this way, Germany, thanks to its dominance over Eastern Europe, has some winning cards in the global fight that it maintains against its competitors Japanese and Americans. Already dominant within the European community, Germany has found a huge new field of exploitation in the East. This has sharpened the tensions between this giant of exploitation and the less successful countries of the community European. In the former socialist countries, democracy, that is, bourgeois democracy, led in 2 years to the rehabilitation of the fascist leaders of the Second World War, Stefan Bandera in Ukraine, Monsignor Tiso in Slovakia, Antonescu in Romania, Anton Pavlik in Croatia. The new bourgeoisie of the East and the former Soviet Union has taken refuge on chauvinism and nationalist ideology to make the workers fall into the trap of their new exploiters. The old nationalist and fascist formations that prospered under the Nazi regime are coming back with a vengeance. Yugoslavia is devastated by war's reactionary civilians. Nationalist civil wars also smolder between Armenians and Azeris, Russians and Moldovans. Serious unrest is brewing in Ukraine. Germany and France, anticipating the prospect of collapse economic, total chaos and civil war in the East and in the Soviet Union, insist on the creation of a European army, capable of maintaining order in the East and in certain independent republics. Military intervention in such a quagmire could have unforeseeable consequences, as demonstrated by the events leading up to the First World War in this region. At the peak of its triumph, capitalism demonstrates that it has nothing to offer the Third World but hunger, savage repression, military aggression and destruction widespread. On the ruins of a defeated socialism, capitalism has nothing more to offer than unemployment, poverty, overexploitation, fascism and civil war. Even at the heart of the civilized world, capitalism can only promise a future of massive unemployment, to which must be added the social regression of racism, the increase in crime, fascism and militarism. 24. The betrayal of the revisionists cannot mask the true nature of the capitalism and imperialism. The true nature of capitalism reveals a bloody and inhuman system that, throughout its entire extension, continues to cause economic, social, political, and moral crises that become deeper and universal over time. The harsh reality of this world has completely exposed the false vanity of the opportunism. When the bourgeoisie proclaims the final fall of communism, it uses the sad bankruptcy of revisionism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union to reaffirm his hatred towards the invaluable work built in the past by Marx and Engels, Lenin, and Stalin. Acting in this way, the bourgeoisie thinks more about the future than about the past. The bourgeoisie tries to make us believe that Marxism-Leninism has been buried for our own good, because he knows perfectly the current situation and the vitality of communist analysis in the current world situation. The paintings of the bourgeoisie also make scientific evaluations of the future of the world. Also they predict major crises, global upheavals, and class struggles. Facing the abyss of unemployment, poverty, exploitation, and violence that opens up for the working masses in the entire world, only Marxism-Leninism can show the way to national and social liberation. It is the mission of communists around the world to finish this challenge. http://www.jcasturias.org